Can tomorrow understand you better than today? Reflections of Mosy Kan. There is something strange about the way understanding works. It does not always arrive when you need it most. It does not come in the middle of the storm, when the wind is loudest and the air is thickest with confusion. It does not show up when you are sitting in the dark at 2 in the morning, replaying the same conversation in your head. It does not appear during the argument, or the silence after the argument, or the long drive home when you cannot remember what you were even fighting for. Understanding, if it comes at all, tends to arrive late. It tends to arrive after, and that has always seemed like a flaw, like something broken in the way human beings process their own lives. Why would clarity wait until the moment has passed? Why would perspective arrive only once the thing that needed perspective is already behind you? But I have been sitting with a different question lately. Not whether this delay is a flaw, but whether it might be something else entirely. Whether the distance that separates today from tomorrow might not be empty space. Whether that distance might in fact be the thing that makes understanding possible at all. Think about how well you know your past self, not the version of you from 20 years ago, though that is interesting too, but the version of you from 2 years ago, 3 years, 5 years, the person you were when something significant was happening, when you were in the middle of something that felt at the time like it might never end. You understand that person now with a kind of clarity that feels almost effortless. You can see what they were afraid of. You can trace the exact shape of the confusion they were carrying. You can see which fears were real and which ones were noise. You can see what they needed, and sometimes painfully, you can see exactly what they were doing instead of getting it. You understand them fully, quietly, without effort. But when you were that person, you did not understand yourself at all. You were guessing, you were reacting, you were building explanations out of whatever material was nearby, trying to make sense of your own behavior in real time, which is perhaps the most difficult kind of sense there is to make. So something happened between then and now. Something changed, and the easy answer is that you learned more. The time gave you information, that you gathered new experiences that illuminated the old ones. But I am not sure that is the whole answer. Because sometimes the understanding arrived before you had any new information. Sometimes you woke up one morning, days or weeks after something happened, and you simply understood it. Not because anything had changed in the world, but because something had changed in the angle from which you were looking. Distance did something that information alone could not. Today is standing too close. That is the thing about today. It is right here. It is inside everything. It is inside the emotion and the confusion and the uncertainty. It is inside the story, while the story is still being written. Trying to understand the plot without knowing how many pages are left. When you are in the middle of grief, today, you cannot see grief clearly. You can only feel it. It can only move through it. The grief fills the entire frame. There is no background, no foreground, no perspective, just the weight of the thing itself pressing in from every direction. When you are in the middle of a difficult decision, today cannot evaluate the options the way tomorrow eventually will. Today is too close to the fear attached to each option, too close to the desire, too close to the voices of other people, still echoing, too close to who you were yesterday to clearly see who you are becoming. Understanding requires a frame. It requires the ability to see where something ends. And today, by definition, is still inside what it is trying to understand. The frame has not yet closed. Tomorrow stands further away. Not because tomorrow is smarter, not because tomorrow has read more books or developed a more sophisticated philosophy, but because tomorrow has the one thing today does not have. Tomorrow has the edge of the frame. There is a particular kind of pain that changes entirely when viewed from a distance, not diminishes. That is not quite the right word. Pain viewed from a distance does not always hurt less, but it looks different. It reveals its own architecture. You can see what it was made of. You can see what it was protecting. You can see sometimes that underneath the pain was something that desperately wanted to be known, something that had been trying for a long time to get your attention and had finally found a way to get it. When you are inside the pain, none of that is visible. When you are inside it, the pain is simply the entire weather system of your interior world. It is all there is to ask you in that moment to understand it. To truly understand it is to ask someone standing in the middle of a hurricane to describe what the storm looks like from above. They cannot, not yet, not from there, but tomorrow, even tomorrow, that is only slightly removed, a week, a month. Tomorrow can sometimes begin to see the shape of the thing, begin to notice what the pain was adjacent to, what it was pointing at, what it was, in some strange way, trying to say. This is not wisdom born from strength. It is understanding born from position, from the simple structural fact of no longer being inside. And now think about how much today judges itself for not understanding, how much confusion about confusion there is, how much frustration about the inability to see clearly, as if clarity is simply a matter of trying harder, as if the person standing in the hurricane is failing because they cannot describe the shape of the storm. Today is not failing. Today is simply inside. Consider the decisions that seem impossible. You have faced them. Everyone has. The kind of decision where both options carry a weight that feels unbearable, where choosing one thing meaning losing something real, where the stakes feel so high that the mind refuses to commit, cycling instead through the same loop of reasoning, arriving at the same impasse, wondering if perhaps there is a third option, a hidden door, some way through that has not yet been found. And then later, sometimes much later, sometimes sooner than expected, you look back at that decision and it seems obvious. Not easy, not painless, but clear. You can see which way you should have gone, or which way you did go, and why it was right, or even why the one that hurt was still the one that fit. The complexity collapses. The thing that seemed like an impossible knot resolves from a distance into something with a visible beginning and the visible end. What changed? The information available was roughly the same. The values involved were roughly the same. The person doing the evaluating was, in most essential ways, the same person. But time had passed, and with time, the emotional charge attached to each option had shifted. The fear had settled or dissolved, or at least stopped vibrating at the frequency that made everything seem equally dangerous. The desire that had been pressing against the decision from one side had either been met or had quietly changed its shape. Today had been too full of the decision to see the decision. Tomorrow had room. There is a question worth sitting with here. When tomorrow understands what today could not, is that understanding more true? Or is it simply more comfortable? Because there is a version of this that is not generous, a version where distance does not clarify but distorts, where time smooths things over that should not be smoothed, where the architecture of pain is revised by memory into something more bearable, more narrative, more meaningful than it actually was, where tomorrow rewrites today rather than understanding it. This is real. Memory is not a recording. Distance is not the guarantee of accuracy. And yet, even accounting for that, even holding that as a real and serious concern, there is something that distance does not presence cannot. There is a kind of seeing that requires not being inside, that requires the thing to have already happened to you, already moved through you, already settled somewhere in the structure of who you are. Perhaps the question is whether tomorrow's understanding is more accurate. Perhaps the question is whether it is more complete, whether the picture has more of itself visible, even if some of the edges have softened, even if some of the details have blurred, whether understanding as a human experience is less about precise recall and more about apprehension of shape. Today sees the pixels, tomorrow begins to see what they form. I think about the people we used to be, not with nostalgia, not only with nostalgia, but with something more like recognition. There's a particular feeling that comes when you look back at the version of yourself and understand, finally, what was happening in them, what that person was carrying that they could not name, what they needed that they could not ask for, what they were trying in their imperfect and sometimes painful and sometimes beautiful way to become. And the feeling is not superiority, it is not smugness of having learned. It is something quieter than that, something closer to tenderness. Because you realize that the understanding you now have of that past self, the understanding that feels so clear, so complete, was not available to them. It could not have been. They were in the middle of becoming the person who would eventually understand them. Them, the understanding required the journey. The journey required the confusion. You had to not understand yourself for a while in order to eventually understand yourself. And this is not a failure of intelligence. It is not a failure of self-awareness or introspection or any of the other qualities we are taught to cultivate. It is simply the structure of how understanding works when the thing being understood is still in motion. You cannot fully understand the river while you are inside the current. You can only understand it from the bank, and you only reach the bank by moving through the water. So what does this mean for today? Not as instruction, not as advice, but as a reflection worth sitting with. Today is somewhere in the middle of something. Every today is. There is something being processed that has not finished processing. There is something being felt that has not yet been understood. There is a version of yourself taking shape that the current version cannot fully see. Not because you are not paying attention, but because you are too close to the work. And perhaps that is allowed. Perhaps today is not supposed to understand everything it contains. Perhaps some of what today is carrying belongs not to today's understanding, but to tomorrow's. Perhaps the confusion is not the problem to be solved, but the process that is occurring. Perhaps some of what today is carrying belongs not to today's understanding, but to tomorrow's. Perhaps confusion is not a problem to be solved, but the process that is occurring. Perhaps the uncertainty that feels like failure is actually just a sensation of being inside something that has not yet finished, becoming what it is. There is something almost revealing about that, if you let it land. You do not have to understand everything you are going through while you are going through it. Understanding will find you, not because time heals, which is too simple and too passive and sometimes not even true, but because time repositions, and position, it turns out, is half of perception. Tomorrow will understand you, not because tomorrow is smarter than you are today, not because tomorrow will have access to information that today lacks, not because the passage of time bestows some special wisdom that cannot be earned any other way. Tomorrow will understand you because it will be standing somewhere today cannot stand. It will be holding the frame that today is still inside. It will see, from wherever it is, the shape of what today could only feel the interior of. And when tomorrow looks back at today, at this moment, this confusion, this weight, this uncertainty, it will not see a failure. It will not see someone who should have known better or felt less or been stronger, or understood more quickly. It will see someone who was inside something real, who was carrying it honestly, who did not have the distance to understand it yet, and who kept moving anyway. Perhaps tomorrow does not understand us because it is smarter. Perhaps tomorrow understands us because it survived what today is still trying to understand. Because it came through the other side of the confusion that today is standing in the middle of. Because it felt like the full weight of what today is carrying and carried it long enough to set it down. Because understanding in the end is not a cognitive achievement. It is not something the mind produces through sufficient effort or attention or intelligence. Understanding is what remains after experience has moved all the way through you. Today is a moving through. Tomorrow is what remains, and what remains finally can see. This has been Reflections of Mosy Kan.